So we wanted to design this last more panel kind of discussion and leave some flexibility. We know that offsets are a topic of great interest for folks. Some folks being very in favor, some folks not. Some folks just wanting more knowledge and understanding. And so we wanted to leave open a little bit of space to sort of unpack the day a little bit. We've received different kinds of questions. We've gathered through those questions where different interests lie, where we could have maybe improved some of the information. And so we kind of want to do that on the upfront portion of this. And so one of the things that I wanted to address, and I had talked about it a little bit during the gate key, and I've mentioned up front in my earlier presentation about Hawaii's commitment to carbon neutrality. And somebody had asked me, what happens with Hawaii's carbon neutrality goal with the creation of offsets? How does that affect the accounting mechanism towards the carbon neutrality goal? And because there's no official agency that defines carbon neutrality, the answer is you can kind of do what you want. But at the same note, from a scientific standpoint, essentially, if you are commoditizing and trading your emissions reduction through offsets, no longer is that emissions reduction in your ownership on your accounting ledger. So one of the things, for example, DOH had a slide up indicating the entire state inventory. DOFA had the same inventory up, noting the sinks, the sequestered carbon in the state of Hawaii, and noted that they are interested in that sink section growing, and certainly planting forest and reforesting and improving forest management. These types of actions would invariably increase that sink section. But if you then take those actions and convert the GHG reduction action, as hopefully has been made apparent today, I believe is the most important portion, offsets being just a way to potentially get that done. If you did do that and then you sold that credit outside of the state of Hawaii, you would not see that sink portion grow at the bottom. You would, in fact, if you started selling that away, you would see it shrink. And so you would make getting to your carbon neutrality goal from a scientific standpoint more difficult through the creation of offsets. Now, if you chose to create offsets and sell them into the state of Hawaii, now we're talking about a different kind of scheme. But that's the general sense of what would happen there, giving you a little bit more information about how offsets work and operate as they relate to the GHG emissions reductions projects that are created. Steve and I were speaking at lunch, and we were speaking a little bit about what kind of to a question that was actually asked a little bit later, like what kind of projects have you been involved when that work, and so just sort of theoretically thinking what would potentially be some kind of areas where offsets are a useful tool in Hawaii, and Steve had some thoughts on that I would be great if you shared.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had a number of folks come up and kind of inquire about what projects work best. And as I didn't get a chance to speak to it in detail in my earlier presentation, but I first of all would point towards kind of the land use opportunities in Hawaii. So on a forestry side of things, I think there's certainly potential there to develop projects that could currently right now be developed towards voluntary markets. There's also, within the California program and the protocol that's been developed there, my understanding is there's been conversations for some time off and on about accepting Hawaii-based projects into that program. And I think there's still certainly interest there and opportunity. I'm not privy to all the complexities, but I think from a market opportunity, if there's a way to, kind of be accepted into that, which will also expand into the other Western Climate Initiative protocols, that would open up the door for a bigger market. The other one that is kind of on the horizon, actually I can't, no pun intended on that, but the airline industry is, and I didn't get a chance to speak to this, it was in one of my slides, but there is a international initiative underway called CORSIA, which stands for Carbon Offset Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And essentially what that's looking to do is put forward a regulated system for aviation that would establish a baseline post-2020 towards carbon neutrality for emissions under aviation. And offsets are currently being looked at as a key tool to that program. And North America has signed up to that. I'm not sure, I would believe Hawaii has as well. I'm not sure about, but
I'm not sure that there's actually a regulatory entity that's.
Well, in terms of pledging to
Pledges.
participate,
Yeah.
The regulatory system, so the program doesn't start until 2021. The compliance period wouldn't start till 2027, I believe, and then goes from 2027 to 2035. But it's being phased in, and so long story short is that's an opportunity to start looking at for land use projects, because they're being very interested in forestry and RED, which is a type of a forestry project that we spoke to. So in thinking through kind of opportunities for Hawaii to think about as they're evaluating offset markets, those are kind of the main ones. Certainly, if you would then go and design a carbon pricing program for Hawaii, offsets could be factored into that. So those are some of the takeaways I had. Yep.
Cool. Yeah, I thought those were good ideas, and so definitely wanted to make sure we got those out there. And so there's one other kind of thing that I want to mention based on some questions and comments that I do think begins to unpack the day, which is, our task when we're working with DLNR is to look at offset programs at large. And one thing I mentioned at the very beginning of the day is that we're going to be assessing offset program feasibility through offset project understanding. And so we've really primarily been laying out what the feasibility is of specific offset projects. And so, for example, the gate key is about whether or not converting a GHG emissions reduction project can convert to an offset. So it's offset projects. But our task is, in fact, program. You can't have a program without projects in it, so that's a reasonable place to start. But the other thing that you need from a program, particularly one of a compliance nature, is you need demand. And the thing that every other compliance offset program has that creates that demand is some kind of carbon pricing. And so that was a question that I got, and it's a quick answer, but that also kind of gets to our second kind of point on this list is carbon pricing. So compliance offset programs only exist within larger compliance programs that include allowances, which is essentially the issuance of an ability to emit. You have, as Steve mentioned earlier in his conversation, you have both allowances and offsets interchanging in these compliance markets. And so allowances is essentially a payment from a regulated entity to emit, and an offset is a payment to a reducing entity to reduce, then sold to a regulated entity, essentially. It's a little bit more complex than that, but that's generally how those things work. And additionally, within these compliance markets, allocations make up 98% of the total market space. So offsets are an incredibly small fraction of these markets. And so you can have issuances of allowances or permits through multiple means. You can put that into a cap and trade system. You could put that into a simple cap and fee system or a tax essentially. But in order to have a compliance offset market, basically you need the projects, which we've talked about feasibility of, and then you need the demand. And it's the payment required to those who are emitting that generally creates that demand. I'll kind of kick it over to Steve for some thoughts on carbon pricing and how that relates to offsets and offset programs, if anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree with your points that, without some form of regulation to create demand, you really are then relying on the voluntary market. And that's not a bad thing, don't get me wrong. But through that, you are, as we showed, there's quite a bit of price variance there, a lower demand, and you're then having to really market your project as it relates to an offset. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people do that. And there certainly are large companies out there that would come in and, as the reforestation project that was presented, would be interested in looking at that. But ultimately, if you're wanting to see the maximum value of those offsets, and that's not just on the price side or the revenue side of things, it's more about incentivizing those reductions, and you have to create some form of a regulation or a demand. And so that's when we look at carbon pricing. And earlier this morning, I kind of walked through all those different programs that are existing around the world. The offset component is a small percentage, but it's also an important percentage because it does look at all those other benefits we talked about, ranging from real reductions to technology transfer to financing all those co-benefits. So.
I think, in some sense, you can think of it as, if you're looking at a regulated market, if we're going to charge those who emit, then we should also pay those who reduce. And that's theoretically kind of where offsets come from. And so offsets are in some ways, and particularly the voluntary market, as Steve mentioned earlier, is a little bit of an incubator into those carbon pricing. Kind of gets people comfortable with the idea of carbon pricing. So if we price the reduction, we can also price the emission. And those things kind of do go hand in hand. And so, Steve says, that the voluntary market, that people incentivize through that's not a bad thing. I think that's right. But I would also, I think, point out that I think some would argue that, the reason that folks are interested in the voluntary market is either for anticipation of regulation, or because they're being regulated somewhere else, and now they're coming to the voluntary market in a different space. So I think you had mentioned being a part of developing landfill gas projects that were primarily driven through anticipation of a regulatory, but it was at the time in a voluntary market. Is that?
Yeah, or as I was saying, pre-compliance,
Yes.
Because people were more or less, I guess, hedging that, the regulation was going to be adopted. So they
Right.
were counting on that against their compliance liability.
Yeah. So there's so much to be said about carbon pricing. We couldn't begin to do the topic justice even in this full panel, but we at least wanted to provide that context, at least in a cursory beginning discussion. This will be something that we'll speak with Danielle about a little bit more. But we also want to get into some other things outside of pricing that actually do help to implement greenhouse gas reductions outside of offsets. And so another thing is codes and building standards. It's basically mandates in planning sectors that require specific things to happen. So energy efficiency standards, requirements for pre-wiring of parking spaces for EV. There's a plethora of planning standards that are essentially mandates that ultimately get at greenhouse gas emissions reductions. These things don't get converted to offsets. Like I said, most GHG emissions reductions, some of the most positive stories about GHG emission reductions have nothing to do with offsets. And so, there's a lot of building standards that are out there. I think if anybody's familiar, most people are probably familiar with LEED. This is not a requirement, but a voluntary building standard, which then many states, cities sort of start to adopt what they put forward as a voluntary standard into just what is required in the regular standard for those states. So then you sort of, again, start looking at voluntary getting converted into requirements for everyone, not just those who feel incentivized by the voluntary market. So I know that the state of Hawaii has numerous codes in this regard. I would say interest in reducing greenhouse gases, that would certainly be another place to look. I just for the sake of time, and because I know I mostly want to hear from Steve about impact investing, and I have less to say on that subject. So if you're all right with this, Steve, I'll kind of save you from speaking about building codes and standards, and instead
Which
ask
I know
you
nothing about. But
and instead ask you about, can you explain what impact investing is and your experience in that area and what you've been able to do and work on in that space?
Sure. So I guess the topic of impact investing and that term is something that's becoming more and more mainstream right now. It is something that is applied in many different ways, but fundamentally, when you're referring to impact investing, you're looking at financial returns as well as kind of that triple bottom line return, or factoring in sustainable development goals from environmental, social aspects. It's kind of evolved over the years out of the social responsibility investment approach to things. We currently work with a few impact investing funds that are interested in carbon as an asset category. So if you're, and these are not retail individual investors, these are funds that have, pension fund money in private capital, so kind of commingled funds that are looking at different investments that produce financial returns as well as kind of environmental, social returns. And so on the climate side or the carbon side, there are a few out there that look towards placing investments in projects, and then one of the return categories is that carbon asset, which they factor in to the current pricing and where it can be in the future. We're involved with one group also that looks heavily at deforestation globally, and that's seeing a lot of interest from a number of different aspects, not just from the climate side of things, but also you have a lot of corporations that are pledging deforestation, and that's factored into their product development side of things, and R&D. So these funds are looking at it from multi-layers. And so, it's a very early stage kind of opportunity for offsets or greenhouse gas reductions. It's an interesting space that's seeing more, certainly more development from larger institutional money and pension funds. And yeah, I think it's an interesting space. It's not, it doesn't have, it's not solving that demand issue that you just raised. But it is certainly becoming, an area that if you have projects that produce a lot of different benefits and you can demonstrate financial returns, there's capital out there to certainly, get.
Sure. So one of the things when I told Steve, hey, I'm going to ask you to talk about your experience here in impact investing, as I said, just to kind of bring it down to, as I said, look, from my understanding, impact investing is essentially folks with money to invest are willing to accept a slightly lower return as long as the investment goes to a more socially responsible things, GHG reductions and things like that. Although the higher return, the better. But there's sort of some willingness as long as there's a social component or a positive benefit. And he said, yeah, that's pretty much it. So, so that's basically what impact investing is. It's a buzzword, but it's something. There's money out there that people are wanting to spend on projects or efforts that are good for good's sake, and they're willing to accept potentially a lower return. And that's what impact investing is.
Yeah, it's also tied. There's a growing movement around divestment. You're seeing mutual funds that are really heavily focused on not investing in anything that has to do with fossil fuels, and impact investing kind of touches on that as well. But when it comes to project-related capital, I think there's a growing pool of funds out there, and to your point, they're not focused solely on 20 or private equity type returns, but willing to have a lower return provided that those investments are meeting a number of other requirements, and those requirements are often aligned with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, as an example. So it's not a bad thing by any means.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just as a quick note, Steve mentioned divestment. If anybody doesn't know what divestment is essentially just removing funds away from fossil fuel companies in short. That's pretty much what that means. So the last point here is voluntary funds. So essentially what this is some kind of fund that's set up where money is put into that fund for a specific purpose, and then what that fund ultimately does is take that money and then put it towards actions that do reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or it puts it towards GHG emissions reduction projects. And so there's two kind of examples of this fund. San Francisco has a carbon fund that folks can donate to, and essentially what they do is they find GHG emissions reduction projects within the region that help to basically toward the cause of the fund, reduce emissions. But these aren't accredited to the same level of scrutiny that offsets are. So there's nothing guaranteed in the trading of these emissions. It's essentially just folks are donating with the expectation that this fund takes the revenues or the money that it generates and then takes these specific actions. And so they can come up with an approximate number of tons they reduce per dollar, but it's not something, if you're doing your emissions inventory and you want to say you're carbon neutral as an entity, you couldn't just necessarily take from this fund and say, we'll take that off our accounting ledger. Instead, you'd say, well, we paid this fund and we know they reduced, and that's a good thing. And that's kind of how these voluntary funds work. California has actually a voluntary fund called the Climate Change Impacts Fund. This is confusingly funded through the revenues from cap and trade. Although, revenues can come from anywhere, but it just so happens that they're coming from the cap and trade program. And then California takes that money that they generated and then pays for projects within the state that meet specific criteria, greenhouse gas reductions being one of those criteria. But other things that they're concerned about are local community benefits, helping developing groups or groups that are subject to different polluting entities. So you can have projects funded there that cost, if you put it in terms of carbon, that cost hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2. But the point isn't necessarily to make sure that you get your biggest bang for your buck on carbon. The point is to make sure the GHG emissions projects get done, and then also that you get those other benefits that the state cares about. So they have that fund that sits there, and then they have projects that apply for those fundings, and then that gets issued out. So voluntary funds is another way to sort of implement GHG emissions reduction projects. And then just for the sake of getting some more Q&A in, I'm just gonna.
I was just gonna
go ahead,
chime
sorry.
in real quickly, only because, I just wanted to also mention that within Oregon's proposed legislation, there's in statute language around reinvestments. And so we're again, a cap and trade model that's linked to California, but taking proceeds from the auction of allowances and then reinvesting that money into, similarly how California has done it, but looking at it, yes, from actual emission reductions, but also addressing impacted communities, rural parts of Oregon. Oregon's a very rural state. And then within that is really applying a number of criteria that promote innovation and R&D and new technology. So it's again, looking at the success that California has done, but applying it more specifically to Oregon, and taking that reinvestment aspect of a carbon pricing model and further reducing emissions, but also kind of looking at it to advance the economy and kind of bring more innovation into the local economy. So I'll end with that one.
Yeah, so basically, when we get across the point that offsets are a tool to implement GHG reductions, the question always is, what are the other tools? And these are some of them, as I kind of mentioned through running through the gate key, the GHG reduction projects taking place on Hawaii that presented. Some of them are actually already going forward. They're already implementing these things. So looking to them as how they were able to do that, whether it was a shift in demand for their product or whether they were able to get money through other means. GHG emissions reduction projects happen through various activities, the same way that anything that gets paid for happens through lots of consideration. And so with that, we'll kind of conclude our plans section on offsets, take some questions, and then do wrap up with Danielle.
Yep. All right, great. This is the first meeting. Props to you all that we have an empty parking lot. This is the first time that has ever happened to me in a public meeting. You guys have stayed on topic and focused on the subject matter, and that's great. So we have time for more Q&A. We have no parking lot to address. Does anybody have any questions? Wow, that's also a first.
Is this because you're well informed or thoroughly confused? This may be not what you were expecting, mainly because of the equivalence of GHG reductions and offsets, but hopefully we're able to enlighten that a little bit. I do see a hand here, though.
No? Oh, great. Hi.
I was just going to say, could you say a little bit about the relationship between carbon taxes and carbon offsets?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to use California's cap and trade system as an example. Even though you just said taxes, I'm going to deviate and talk about cap and trade and caveat that by saying economically, cap and trade and taxes do the exact same thing. They just pull from different levers. There's a lot to unpack there, but I'm going to talk about California's cap and trade because I think it's easier to address your question. Basically, within California's cap and trade compliance market, there sits an offset program. And basically, within California's cap and trade, one of the most important features is the cap. And so fundamentally, what California has done is said, what is the total cap on the emissions that we want to allow in the state? Once they decide that number, then they basically, out of thin air, create allowances. These are now the allowances that are representative of the emissions that we want to allow in this state. So the allowances now exist as the pool of what we're going to allow, and they need a way to distribute those to those entities that emit. Now, the entities that emit cannot do so at this point unless they have an allowance. So the way that California does that is through numerous, very complicated means, but basically they do it through giving some of them away for free and selling some of them at auction. The entities that are regulated then get some for free sometimes. They can go to auction to buy them. They can also trade amongst themselves. So that's the trade component of cap and trade. So that's the allowances. Now, within that program, California allows regulated entities to fulfill what's called their obligation, which is equal to their emissions that they need allowances for. They're able to fulfill that obligation through 8% of it through offsets. So in this market, offsets are a compliance alleviation mechanism for regulated entities because offsets trade at a lower price point than allowances. It's usually, I think, $2 to $3 cheaper at this point in time. So any entity, let's say there's an entity that emits 100 units, as I was speaking to someone, they said, let's say 100 units. I said, that's simple, let's do it. 100 units, let's say. Nobody emits 100, but 100 units. And so basically, they're then obligated to surrender 100 allowances. Now, they can submit 98 allowances and 8 offsets, but they need to go to the offset developers and elsewhere to find the offsets. And so in the cap and trade program, California receives its revenue through the sale of the allowance and doesn't touch the financial component of offsets. The financial component of offsets is completely between the developers and the entities that need those offsets. I know that's a bit complicated. I'm not sure how clear that explanation was. I'll kind of ask Steve if he has something to add, and then I'll make sure that.
Yeah, we'll just go back to, I think the question was on a tax and
Yep.
how offsets can factor into that. And I would say typically a carbon tax is just a straight up, it looks at a taxing carbon emissions, not providing the flexibility or the different components that cap and trade or what's also called a market-based approach. And that's where offsets often live. It's not to say that offsets can't live in a tax model, but oftentimes they aren't included in that. There's a lot of hybrid approaches to carbon pricing. Earlier today, I just mentioned about the Canadian federal program that's looking as a backstop to provinces that aren't pricing emissions. That's more or less looking at it from a tax angle, but there actually is an offset aspect to that as well. So it's not a cut and dry answer to your question there, but offsets typically are harmonized more with the market-based cap and trade program.
Question. Since carbon taxes and cap and trade both exist throughout the world, as emissions are going up, and we have 10 years to do something about it. What is your solution?
What I would say is, they do exist throughout the world, but they don't exist everywhere. But then I would also say that we don't necessarily have a position on whether or not some state should adopt, or at least AECOM doesn't have a position, I think, on this. So, we could provide.
I think,
But
yeah.
Steve might be
Well,
more willing
that's
to
a-
provide a position.
Certainly could have a few beers and talk that over.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tend to be more of a fan of the market-based approach. But, there's, right now, to your question, like, the clock is ticking. And, I think we have to be looking at all different types of solutions out there. Politically, a tax is a really hard thing to swallow, even though it's doing almost the same thing that a cap and trade program is doing. And in order to really price that social cost that I brought up briefly today at the level it needs to be, which is going to then drive all that significant behavior change, it has to be priced pretty much higher than it is right now. So it's one of those situations where we're seeing, momentum coming out of Paris. It's certainly slow, it's bureaucratic. And when I say Paris, I'm talking about the Paris Agreement, not just current day Paris. And yeah, it's frustrating for someone that's been, around this for a number of years. But at the same time, I think, you have to factor in not just pricing, but all the other aspects that go into various types of programs, whether it's renewable portfolio standards or looking at, incentivizing electrification. So pricing is just one component of it. And I think we have to be somewhat agnostic, I would say, or figure out what works best within your current jurisdiction or state, because some places cap and trade might not make sense. A tax could be an easier program to roll out. So those are a few thoughts to your question, but there's no silver bullet right now, unfortunately.
And I guess with that too, I can add, because I've said this already, that the thing that people should be focusing on is what are the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are happening, or that the actions that are possible. Offsets is one tool to implement, carbon pricing is another, building codes and standards is another. And so I wouldn't want to take a stance on which one of the tools to use to get those emissions reductions done. But certainly, getting emissions reductions done, whether that's renewable energy, which will be needed, biofuels, or sustainable fuels, renewable fuels, efficiencies. There's various things that need to happen as far as just technologically. And we do have the technologies, they do exist. So it's the way to get them implemented through governments or markets is something that, as Steve kind of pointed out, is a bit up to the local areas to make sure they get done the way they need them done.
Yeah, and one other quick note, sorry, is just that, carbon pricing needs to be looked at as part of a bigger solution. So it's one tool in the quiver, so to speak, but where we're seeing success happen is when states or jurisdictions are putting in low carbon fuel standards and renewable portfolio standards and transitioning, out coal. And then oftentimes the carbon pricing model is kind of inserted as a complementary component to that, but it's not a, complete solution to it. It's part of a bigger set of tools.
So we're over on time, but if you have a quick one, we can try and fit it in. Yeah.
Hello, hi, I'm Julius with Hawaii Green Growth, and we're a network, so part of our business partners have been working with the Nature Conservancy on the carbon offset project that Trey mentioned. My question is about kind of public dialogue and awareness on carbon offsets and carbon in general. So we're hosting kind of a Civil Beats facilitated public forum on April 23rd, which will line up nicely with today's events. So first of all, thank you for coming here today and kind of sharing this context with us. What are some of the observations that you have from other places on how to engage the public more broadly on the jargon, the concepts, to have kind of a statewide public dialogue on what is a carbon tax, is it appropriate, is it fair, those things. So if you have any thoughts on how we should, as local partners, keep working on that awareness, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. I would say there's a lot to unpack there. So, one thing is you're welcome to take the tool and demonstrate that. But this is a tough subject. There's a lot of, as mentioned, a lot of sort of interchanging language, the way people are communicating, and so just having the people show up to have the dialogue is the first step. I'm going to kind of give it to Stephen. He does a lot of this work, and then just for the sake of time, if you want, I'll hang out afterwards. We could talk a little bit more. So, but anything else you want to say on stage, Steve?
Well, it's just try to focus in on kind of the key messages based off of the audience that you're trying to speak to. Obviously, because this topic, as you've picked up today, is complicated and can go in a lot of different directions. If you're trying to, explain the benefits of, a forest carbon project and what that is and how it works, that can be kind of a focus. But if you wanted to look at it more broadly, then you have to consider that you're kind of going back to some of the things we discussed earlier this morning, which is, how, climate change impacts things and, the role of carbon accounting and all that. If you go down, so it really, I would just say it depends on, it's an important thing to do, but it depends on your audience and what you're trying to get them to understand.
I guess I would add one kind of final thing is that when you're thinking about how you're communicating with your audience and just kind of acting in general, I think one of the things to just is sort of high level to consider is it's much more impressive to learn than it is to know. And so just keeping in mind that whatever you are bringing to the table is a certain set of knowledge and making sure that you're constantly learning feedback from the groups that you're dealing with. And that way you can sort of begin to have a connected understanding level of communication where we're talking about the same things and communicating effectively. So.